Stories are one of the oldest means of conveying information. It's how we teach values and morals to the new generation. Fables like The Boy Who Cried Wolf teach our children that eventually lies will cause people not to trust you. Or in Hansel and Gretel, we learn that too much of a good thing can have bad consequences. We can also use stories to explore real concepts. Sure, Harry Potter is a fantasy, but dealing with loss, corruption, and injustice is not. Stories are a way for us to communicate information and explore ideas in new ways. But every new piece of information we receive has a learning curve, especially fiction. You need to understand the world before you can understand the story's message, but if Harry Potter listed out all of the characters you meet and their description at the start of the book, you probably wouldn't have read it. There is a storytelling technique called in media res, which means in the middle. A story will plop you at the center of the action, telling you nothing, and the storyteller's job is to make sure that you understand the rules of how this world works, despite your lack of any backstory. Especially in fiction, you need this information to follow the story, but what movies, shows, and books have mastered that games have not is feeding you only the information you need to know right at this moment. Games have one major disadvantage to this storytelling technique: the tutorial. With any game, not just video games, before you can really experience playing it, you first have to learn the rules. What are the boundaries? How do you fit in as a player? What is your objective? How do you progress? While you aren't asking these questions outright, there is an expectation that you'll be given the answers so that you can learn to play. This can be your dad showing you how to play poker, or your college roommate helping you roll up a D&D character. But for video games, there is no one to hold your hand except the game itself. Early games came with an instruction manual, listing out your moveset and combos, listing key items, and maybe giving you a little introduction to the world and your place in it. You might even look back on the instruction manual fondly, remembering how your parents finally let you buy that game you've wanted, and you tore open the box on the way home in the car, desperate to consume as much as you could immediately. Despite the instruction manual, there are still things you must learn by doing, so in-game tutorials have replaced the instruction manual entirely. Now, you boot up a game and are immediately locked in a bubble-wrapped room while the game teaches you how to play it. Left stick to move, right stick for the camera. This immediately breaks the fourth wall. Sure, you could skip some tutorials, but the game doesn't believe you actually don't want the information, so then proceeds to force it on you with pop-ups, text boxes, and in some case freezing the frame at every new item or enemy. Take a look at Skyward Sword. Nintendo notoriously wants their games to be accessible to as wide of an audience as possible, which is fine. The new controls of the Wii are different than vets of the series are used to, so there is a long, slow tutorial through Skyloft. You don't really begin the game until around 2 hours in, and even then you are just bombarded with pop-ups and alerts about every item, enemy, and clue. There is no self-discovery when you're just simply told. Skyward Sword even takes it a step further and has to remind you every time, because if you're just told, you're also not learning. How many rupees is the red one worth again? More recent games try to cleverly work their tutorial into story so the knowledge isn't dumped on you and is instead discovered. Sticking with Zelda, let's look at one of my favorite tutorials, in Breath of the Wild. You're given a small cutscene, you wake up, and know nothing but your experience with the franchise. And since Link remembers nothing, you and Link know the same amount of information. In fact, one of the game's collectibles, the memories, present the story to you at the same time as Link. But in the game's tutorial, pop-ups show you basic controls with graphics, not text. Once outside, you begin to pick up on small clues scattered about. Fire cooks food. You need protection from the cold. Exploration is rewarded. Nintendo has taken off the training wheels. None of these things the game tells you with a monologue. The apple is baked, Link shivers when it's cold, and your health is draining. Breath of the Wild tells you the basics and then leaves it up to you to figure out the rest. It is 5 years later, and I just learned today that there is a little chest icon that appears on your map above the shrine if you found all of the treasure inside of it. Tunic's tutorial takes it a step further by starting you off with even less information. This is why the tutorial of Tunic feels like it doesn't exist, even though it does. You are led down a specific path with breadcrumbs. Tunic doesn't tell you anything, at least not directly. You frequently come across things that stick out, things that you know are important but you don't understand. Yet, you see no other characters to interact with, yet there's a light on in a house. This is where you first pick up the stick. However, you can't chop bushes with the stick even though you see stuff over there, so you must need to find something to chop the bushes. You're never told to find a sword, but instead the visual cues lead you to believe you need an item to progress further. There's a weather vane, but you have no idea its purpose. However, the lack of understanding will gnaw at you to keep you going to find the answers on your own. The game never tells you these things with a text box, instead using clues in the environment to nudge your brain to the right thoughts. Good exposition boils down to making the observer believe they drew the conclusion on their own. It's the core of storytelling in any format. Show, don't tell. Since video games are a relatively new storytelling medium, we're still learning how this transfers to gameplay rather than cutscenes, and one of the biggest ways to do that is through environmental storytelling. Environmental storytelling is easily one of my favorite mechanisms in games because it's so powerful. For me, it's why Breath of the Wild resonated so well. Another master of this technique is a short little indie called Rime. In Rime, you have cutscenes, but the bulk of exposition comes in the form of gameplay. The main way to interact with the world, your voice, changes through the game. It starts off sort of curious, playful, exploratory, just like your environment. As you progress and as the mood changes, so too does your voice. Mighty, scared, meek. Without giving anything away, this story is a super simple one that's been done time and time again, but Rime stands out among the rest simply because of its delivery. When I got to the ending and the realization finally hit me, I sat in silence for a good 2 hours just reflecting. It's that well done. Tunic's story is delivered through gameplay in a similar way. You start the game knowing nothing, and the environment is one filled with curiosity and exploration. There's things you know are definitely important, but have no idea how to interact with them at first, like the weather vane or strange yellow pads scattered throughout the world. There are enemies everywhere, and no other friendly creatures to explain. Crumbling buildings may have a chest in it, already open, suggesting that someone or something opened it before you. Eventually you'll come across the game's major collectible, the pages to an instruction manual, calling back to this time when you were expected to read it cover to cover before popping the cartridge in the console. Only, you can't read everything. Some of it is in a strange language and you think maybe you'll understand it at some point, but what you can read is enough to make out exactly what you need to know in this moment. These are things that are more difficult to show through environment. For example, there's a brief period of time during a dodge roll that you're invulnerable. In the heat of combat, it would be difficult to see this play out naturally, so the instruction manual can fill in that gap without being too invasive. You get exactly out of the manual what you need. You can choose to never open the manual at all in the game and still beat it, and that's completely up to you. But since the manual is still a part of the game, a part of the story, it never feels like you were going into a pause menu, selecting settings, tabbing down to controls, and looking at a controller map of buttons and functions. Since it's a part of the story and a part of the game, it feels natural. Which means you can study the pages until your eyes start crossing, trying to pry out the layers of their purpose and story. Every tiny morsel of knowledge has you hitting the instruction book, because that knowledge reminded you of that weather vane from way back in the very beginning. But if you're lucky enough to be going into Tunic completely blind, around the 2/3 mark you'll learn of a core gameplay mechanic that completely shifts the entire story. You begin to look at everything differently. Everything is a piece of the puzzle, and the pages, or the tutorial, have been telling you this all along. It's the perfect blend of gating progression behind an item, the pages, and knowledge, what the pages uncover. Slowly at first, in layers, then deeper and deeper and deeper until you're flipping through them like a madman because you understand now. The third act is when the real game begins. when you have enough of the tools and knowledge to understand what the game is trying to get you to do. You no longer need the training wheels, and the pages are no longer just a guide, but more keys to unlocking the mysteries of the world and your place in it. The instruction manual's layers mirror the environments. As you progress and gain knowledge about the world, the layers of the instruction manual are peeled back, revealing an entirely new way to play the game. Suddenly, the coffee stains that seemed like just a nice artistic flair have a much deeper story. Tunic's layers are the key to its successful blend of tutorial and storytelling. It gives you just enough pieces of the puzzle to draw you to your own conclusions, but not too much that you feel like the game is throwing it in your face. Humans have a natural curiosity and thirst for knowledge, and by rewarding this self-discovery instead of holding your hand, your brain is trained on not just how to play, but how to peel back the layers to get the most out of the game. The tutorial, gameplay, and story are so intricately intertwined that you don't notice the backdrop, the medium it's being delivered to you on. Stories work the best when you forget that they're stories. When you can lose yourself in a book or binge 4 seasons in one sitting, that's when a story is working. But for games, you can't just lose yourself since the inputs you enter into your controller impact your experience with the narration. You can never fully lose yourself in a story in the same way. Tunic addresses this by integrating your part in the story as canon. Every button press impacts the narrative. Your experience is the story, all of it. Even booting the game up is part of the story. Even if you decide Tunic is not for you an hour in and never play it again, that experience is both valid and canon. You become part of the game in a unique way that lets the story told through your gameplay feel impactful. As games evolve to tell stories better, tutorials need to evolve too. Tunic puts a unique twist on this by using the very same human trait that fuels the whole need for stories anyway: the quest for knowledge. I want to take a second and thank you all for sharing your thoughts with me on my other videos. I'm overwhelmed by the amount of support from you guys the last few weeks. I also just wanted to give a huge thank you to Rod's Caden, another lover of stories who helped me edit this script. His channel is linked below if you want to check him out. Again, thank you for all of your subscriptions and comments. I read every single one. Thank you.